Hey guys, tonight we begin in the kind of place that smells like wood smoke, iron dust, and something suspiciously herbal. Someone insists is tea. We're traveling deep into 17th century Central Africa, modern day Angola, to be precise, where the air hangs thick with monsoon memories and the occasional misplaced spear. The land is lush, humming, and entirely uninterested in your comfort. There are insects here the size of your thumb, and soldiers who haven't napped in weeks. This was the kingdom of Ndongo, and it was not, shall we say, built for the faint of heart. You probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where and when you're listening from. Morning tea in Portland, midnight stew in Manchester. I'm always curious. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing worth knowing is that Queen Nzinga wasn't always a queen. She was born around 1583 to the royal family of Ndongo, one of the many sophisticated and thoroughly underappreciated kingdoms in Africa that European maps labeled as "Here be confusion" for far too long. Her father, Ngola Kiluwanji Kia Samba, try saying that after your third mug of warm goat's milk, was a canny ruler with more political enemies than friends, which is how you know he was doing his job correctly. Nzinga, even as a small child, seemed unnervingly aware of how power worked. Legend has it she spoke clearly within days of birth and demanded a better blanket by the time she was 3. She was named Nzinga because her umbilical cord was wrapped around her neck, a bad omen in some traditions, a sign of resilience in others. In this case, it was clearly the latter. She survived, thrived, and made an early habit of sitting in on state meetings, offering quiet, bone-dry observations like, "I don't think this Portuguese treaty is very good, Father." Her father, to his credit, tolerated these interruptions, perhaps because Nzinga had a habit of being annoyingly right. She watched him lead the Ndongo kingdom during an era when Portuguese colonizers were making themselves aggressively at home along the coasts. They weren't great guests. They brought traders, missionaries, and that lovely old classic guns, but mostly they brought the simmering promise that if you gave them an inch of land, they'd come back tomorrow demanding 3 more, and a tax on the soil. Ndongo at the time was balanced on the edge of a spear. Internally, there were nobles with ambitions, external threats from neighboring kingdoms, and of course the Portuguese, who had a knack for drawing maps of land they hadn't yet conquered, but were awfully enthusiastic about. As a child, Nzinga observed that the Portuguese obsession with formal chairs was not just a furniture preference, it was strategy. This realization would later lead to one of the more famous diplomatic moments in African history, but for now, let's pause and imagine young Nzinga at her father's side. Not quite tall enough to see over the scroll table, but certainly bold enough to voice an opinion about who should and should not be allowed in court. She was educated, which was more than you could say for some of her future European opponents. She spoke Kimbundu fluently, of course, but would later learn Portuguese too, because nothing says, "I plan to outwit you," like speaking your language better than you do. Historians still argue whether Nzinga's early brilliance came from formal schooling or an uncanny intuition sharpened by watching men argue about salt taxes for 6 hours a day. But what's agreed upon is that by the time she was a teenager, she had mastered diplomacy, battle strategy, and the subtle art of not laughing when a rival noble tripped over his ceremonial spear. Now here's the first curious detail your textbooks probably skipped Nzinga's early tutors included women from the royal matrilineal clan who specialized not only in language and politics, but also in something delightfully specific: ritual insult poetry. That's right. In her spare time, Nzinga learned how to eviscerate an opponent with well-metered verse. It's the kind of training that makes you wonder what the school assemblies must have been like. Meanwhile, her father struggled to keep the kingdom afloat under relentless pressure. The Portuguese were increasingly demanding slaves in exchange for weapons, and the entire region was caught in a cruel logic spiral. Protect yourself from raiders by buying guns, but to get guns, you had to trade people, which weakened your own population and invited more raids. It was like trying to fix a leaky roof by tearing down your own walls. And the rain kept coming. Nzinga's older brother Mbandi wasn't handling the pressure well. But we'll get to his tragic arc later. For now, the court of Ndongo is a bustling mix of old wisdom, wary eyes, and half-whispered jokes about the latest Portuguese envoy accidentally eating the royal cook's surprise fish. It was always better not to ask what the surprise was. At the center of it all sat Nzinga, observing, learning, and quietly taking note of who interrupted whom, who bowed too deeply, and who might be planning a little treachery after supper. And yes, in case you're wondering, the royal goat was already part of the scene by now. No one remembers exactly where it came from, but it had developed a habit of wandering through meetings and chewing on important documents, which, if anything, just added to the kingdom's charm. And so, in the fading candlelight of a court under siege, with stew bubbling gently in the corner, and the buzz of politics, louder than the insects outside Nzinga, prepared herself not just to survive history, but to write it from the throne itself. The problem with treaties Nzinga would later muse was that they were rarely worth the paper they were scribbled on, especially when said paper had just been gnawed by the court goat. But long before she sat on any throne, or made Europeans nervously adjust their wigs, she was dispatched on one of the most delicate diplomatic missions in Ndongo's memory, a peace negotiation with the Portuguese in Luanda. It was 1622 and the kingdom was buckling under siege. Nzinga's brother now, King Mbandi, was struggling to keep hold of power, and to put it gently, he was not exactly known for his people skills. So, with war at the gates and morale beneath the floorboards, he sent his sister, clever, composed, and far more fluent in diplomacy than he would ever be, to represent Ndongo in negotiations with the colonial governor. The Portuguese expected a soft-spoken woman, possibly veiled, certainly docile. What they got was Nzinga, in full ceremonial regalia, eyes sharp as obsidian, voice silk-wrapped steel. And here enters the infamous chair incident. Picture it: the governor's receiving hall in Luanda, a space not designed for comfort but intimidation, high ceilings, polished tile floors, the faint smell of old incense and bureaucratic sweat. The Portuguese governor had arranged a room where all the Europeans sat in sturdy elevated chairs, while the native envoy, Nzinga, was left with a mat on the floor. Symbolism subtle as a slap. But Nzinga, who had spent her youth observing court politics and furniture placement like a seasoned strategist, had no intention of kneeling. So with one glance at the insult before her, she gave a quiet nod. An attendant, possibly warned beforehand, possibly just an excellent improviser, promptly knelt behind her, forming a living chair with his knees. Nzinga seated herself calmly eye level, with the governor unbothered and unbowed. Now historians still argue whether this story unfolded exactly as told. Some say the living chair was a metaphor. Others insist it happened, and a few suspect the court goat was involved and simply hasn't been credited. Regardless, the message was clear. You may have guns, I have spine. The negotiations began. And Nzinga, she was brilliant, fluent in Portuguese, elegant in delivery, and armed with both facts and veiled threats. She argued for peace on behalf of her brother's kingdom. The Portuguese, amused, at first quickly realized they were being maneuvered into signing a treaty they didn't entirely understand. Nzinga secured concessions land and a temporary cessation of hostilities. She even agreed to convert to Christianity, taking the baptismal name Dona Ana de Souza, a move equal parts spiritual pageantry and strategic brilliance. Ah, yes, conversion. Not the sincere, tear-streaked kind missionaries longed for, but the cold, calculated flavor best served over chilled diplomacy. To be fair, Nzinga did seem to appreciate aspects of Christian practice, but to imagine her bowing in true religious submission would be like imagining the royal goat filing tax returns. No, Nzinga's baptism was a message. She was willing to adapt, willing to speak their language, willing to play the part if it meant saving her kingdom. In return, she expected the Portuguese to honor their treaty. Spoiler, they did not. Within a year, the Portuguese resumed hostilities. The treaty turned out to be little more than decorative parchment, a gift from the colonizers to their own conscience. Mbandi, meanwhile, grew paranoid and erratic, reportedly murdering rival nobles and even his own son. He did not appreciate Nzinga's popularity, nor her talent for doing his job better than he ever could. And so, for her troubles, Nzinga was banished, sent away by her own brother, exiled from the court she just saved. It's unclear whether she packed lightly, but one imagines she took her dignity and a few select scrolls with her, possibly a hammock, and maybe the goat followed. But let's linger for a moment on what she achieved in Luanda, a young African woman in a foreign court, outnumbered, outarmed, and quite possibly the smartest person in the room. She didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She negotiated peace with nothing but wit language and the ability to turn a servant into a chair without breaking eye contact. There's a fringe historian name lost to a stew-stained footnote who once claimed Nzinga invented psychological warfare that day, not with violence but with posture. The Portuguese weren't just taken aback by her words, they were unnerved by her presence. She wasn't like the leaders they were used to. She didn't swagger, didn't yell, didn't make rash threats. She sat still and calm and watched them squirm. As night fell over Luanda that evening with the sound of distant waves crashing against colonial ships, one imagines the governor reclining in his actual chair, wondering if perhaps he'd just witnessed something far more powerful than an army. He'd met a queen in everything but title, and something told him, deep in his slightly wine-sodden brain, that she'd be back. Oh, and the mat they'd given her, rumor says, she folded it and took it with her, just in case she ever needed to start a new court from the floor up. The Portuguese, as it turns out, were not the only ones prone to short-term memory. Less than a year after Nzinga's triumph in Luanda, her diplomatic victories had dissolved faster than a treaty left out in the rain. The ink was barely dry when the Portuguese resumed hostilities, pressing deeper into Ndongo territory, like guests who overstayed, complained about the stew, and then started setting fire to the guest house. Back home, things weren't faring much better. Nzinga's brother Mbandi, now fully unraveled by the pressures of leadership and possibly too much fermented palm wine, had become a walking cautionary tale in crown form. He saw enemies in every corridor. Allies fled, and courtiers learned to avoid eye contact or risk being demoted to person we don't talk about anymore. Nzinga returned to a kingdom cracking at the edges. Instead of gratitude, she was met with suspicion. Mbandi, threatened by her growing influence, exiled her once again, this time for good. Whether it was a formal decree or just a very cold breakfast with no seat at the council table, the message was clear: leave or be removed by less poetic means. So Nzinga left. And here begins the part of her story most forget or underestimate. She didn't go quietly. She didn't mope. She didn't vanish into the jungle to compose sad poetry and wait for a better season. She gathered her followers, packed what she could possibly, including the now famous mat and a travel-sized goat, and made her way to the land of Matamba. Now, Matamba wasn't exactly a retirement paradise. It was a neighboring kingdom already inhabited, and not especially looking for a deposed foreign royal. But Nzinga was nothing if not persuasive. Within a short time, she made alliances with local leaders, outmaneuvered rivals, and essentially absorbed Matamba into her power base. Some called it diplomacy. Others whispered about a very strategic marriage or two. Still others believed Nzinga had a supernatural gift for turning no into, of course, your highness. Meanwhile, her brother's rule deteriorated like old stew under the sun. And then quite suddenly, perhaps after a particularly bad bowl of it, he died. Some say it was suicide. Others suspect poisoning. A few scholars have suggested the royal cat might have been involved, though this is generally not accepted by mainstream academia. Whatever the cause, Mbandi was gone. Nzinga, though in exile, declared herself the rightful queen. But as anyone who's ever tried to claim a throne remotely knows, it's never quite that simple. Rivals emerged. Nobles objected. The Portuguese naturally disapproved. They had been hoping for someone more malleable, someone they could bribe with woolen cloaks and unfulfilled promises. Instead, they got Nzinga, who, as always, brought her own seat to the table. Her first acts as queen were sharp, and depending on whom you asked, either ruthlessly efficient or gloriously overdue. She executed several nobles who had collaborated with the Portuguese. She restructured alliances. And yes, there are stories, some whispered, some proudly shouted, that she ordered the drowning of political rivals in ceremonial pools. Whether true or exaggerated by horrified missionaries, the message was received. Queen Nzinga was not to be trifled with. Historians still argue whether she was more warrior than politician or more politician than queen. But what's clear is this Nzinga didn't merely survive exile. She used it like a whetstone. She returned sharper, stronger, and less patient with colonial nonsense. Now here's the curious detail that tends to get left out of the textbooks. Nzinga had a secret weapon, not a sword, not a siege engine, but a troop of female bodyguards, all trained, all loyal, and all apparently terrifying. These women, known for their discipline and precision, were said to serve her in both battle and court. One legend even claims they dressed as men in combat and wore intricate ceremonial armor made of raffia and brass. There are fewer details on their opinions about the bard who never stopped singing during drills, but they were, by all accounts, not easily amused. One of Nzinga's earliest declarations in Matamba was that her court would be mobile. She would not be rooted in palaces, but would move with her people, setting up comfortable, surprisingly well-decorated war camps as she went. These weren't your standard muddy tents and grumbling soldiers. These were structured, hierarchical villages that traveled with her, complete with cooks, poets, advisors, and yes, sleeping hammocks arranged by rank. And just to be clear, these hammocks were taken seriously. Warrior who tried to upgrade his hammock without authorization was once reportedly reassigned to latrine detail. The system worked. As for the Portuguese, they watched with growing unease as Nzinga's influence swelled. She had regrouped, retrained her forces, forged new alliances, and was beginning to nibble at their outposts like a polite but relentless termite. They began to refer to her not just as a rebel or native queen, but with the distinct tone of colonial fear, reserved for people who keep winning in ways you don't understand. And so Nzinga, the exile, the diplomat, the self-throned queen, now prepared for war, but not all at once. First, she had to write a few letters, reallocate some goats, and order a fresh batch of stew pots. Victory, after all, is more delicious when it's well seasoned. There are many ways to reclaim a throne. Some favor the classic military coup. Others attempt polite diplomacy backed by slightly less polite armies. Nzinga, however, reclaimed hers in a silk robe with the poise of a woman who'd already measured the doorway for her crown. Word spread quickly through Ndongo and Matamba. Queen Nzinga had returned, and she had no intention of asking permission. After her brother's death, a half-hearted council attempted to place his young son on the throne. This would have made a decent show of continuity had the boy not been both too young and too terrified to speak in public. And also had he not immediately been reassigned from life itself under suspicious circumstances. That's a delicate way of saying Nzinga may have ordered his execution. The records are murky. Some accounts claim he died of illness. Others suggest he tripped into a particularly aggressive stew cauldron. Nzinga never commented. Either way, the crown was now firmly hers, and she wasted no time making it fit. Her first acts weren't merely consolidating power, they were about sending a message. Gone were the days of appeasement and second-guessing. Nzinga demanded loyalty. And if you couldn't offer that, she'd accept silence and absence, and sometimes permanent absence. She renamed herself Queen of both Ndongo and Matamba, a bold statement in a time when women rulers were rare and ones who ruled two kingdoms were virtually unheard of. The Portuguese scoffed, then reconsidered, then gritted their teeth when their emissaries returned with peace proposals signed in ink blood or stew, depending on the available materials. Now here's where the story picks up speed like a goat discovering unattended bread. Nzinga, now securely in power, decided she would not fight the Portuguese on their terms. Instead of chasing them across familiar routes or attacking well-fortified cities, she created something ingenious: mobile war camps. Imagine them organized like miniature kingdoms with fabric-draped command tents, stew pits that simmered all day, and rotating guards who'd perfected the art of looking intimidating while holding ladles. The camps moved with her. When she advanced, they advanced. When she retreated, they melted into the trees like fog. They were clean, disciplined, and by all contemporary accounts, remarkably comfortable. Soldiers slept in hammocks instead of on the ground. Meals were hot, latrines were dug deep, and morale was strangely high for an army on the run. Even her enemies begrudgingly admired them. One Portuguese commander is said to have muttered, "She's running a kingdom out of tents," before falling into a pothole laid by her scouts and resigning in shame. Nzinga's genius wasn't in brute force. It was in adaptability. When cornered, she disappeared. When ignored, she resurfaced. She used the terrain like an extension of herself. Forests became shields, rivers became traps, and high ground was always reserved for the stew pot and strategy meetings. Still, not all in her camp were thrilled. Some of her advisors worried about appearances. One reportedly asked, "Your Majesty, is it dignified for a queen to sleep in a hammock. Nzinga's reply is unrecorded, but that advisor was later seen sleeping very peacefully next to the goat pens, permanently reassigned to stew duty. She understood something fundamental survival in the 17th century colonial grind wasn't about showing off. It was about endurance. The Portuguese had castles and gunpowder, but they couldn't figure out how to fight an enemy who never held still. One fringe account even mentions Nzinga deploying false camps, empty hammocks strung between trees, stew fires lit with no one cooking, even wax effigies of guards to throw off scouts. The deception worked more than once. Several colonial units charged into one of these decoy camps only to find it eerily deserted, except for one goat who stared at them like they were the idiots and then ate their map. But the war camps weren't just tactical. They were cultural hubs. Nzinga brought her court with her advisors, poets, scribes, even a traveling scribe who specialized in turning battlefield events into poetic verse, though he was banned from rhyming spear, with fear more than once a week. She also brought justice. Nzinga held court sessions inside the tent of judgment, a simple canvas structure with a brass lamp, 3 hammocks, and a stack of scrolls that may or may not have included a few recipes. Disputes were heard, crimes punished, and new laws declared. One particularly memorable law stated that any soldier who stole from the stew pot would be required to scrub every pot for a week while singing his confession, loudly, off-key. Historians still debate whether this was meant to deter theft or simply to amuse Nzinga during long nights. And through it all, she remained visible, riding through the camp, inspecting kitchens, conferring with generals, and occasionally engaging in late-night debates with the royal goat, who by now had acquired a saddle ceremonial, of course, and a troubling sense of entitlement. This perhaps more than anything explains Nzinga's success. She didn't hide behind walls or titles. She lived with her people, moved with them, ate with them, and if needed, fought beside them. And in this oddly mobile monarchy of hammocks, hot stew, and slow-burning resistance, Nzinga built something far more dangerous than an army. She built loyalty. In most stories, when enemies close in on a ruler's camp, panic erupts. Orders are barked, stew is spilled, goats scatter. But in Nzinga's war camps, even with Portuguese troops approaching the stew, simmered on schedule, the hammocks swayed gently in the breeze, and Queen Nzinga, by all reports, stirred her porridge with the calm of someone wondering what spice to add next. That's not to say she was careless. Nzinga was simply prepared. She knew the Portuguese were coming. They always were. They had this pesky habit of assuming every lull was a weakness, every treaty a prelude to conquest. And Nzinga, in turn, had developed a reliable strategy for such situations: stay calm, stay mobile, and let them get tired. The camp, though constantly shifting, was no shanty town. It had a designated command tent, a ceremonial hammock for visitors, a well-worn lecture rock for her advisors to stand on when complaining, and a tiny shrine made of carved wood and copper, offering prayers to ancestors and perhaps also to good soup weather. On the day her scouts reported a Portuguese column just 10 miles out, Nzinga did not issue a dramatic speech. She didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she called a council of her generals, unrolled a goatskin map, and calmly pointed to 3 places, one for an ambush, one for a decoy fire pit, and one for the goat, who by this time had his own tent and a strong preference for melon rinds. The Portuguese arrived sweaty, irritable, and thoroughly confused. You see, the camp looked unguarded. Smoke rose gently from cook fires. A few laundry lines flapped in the wind. There was even a pot left unattended, bubbling ominously. But there were no soldiers in sight, no guards, just silence and hammocks. Naturally, the commander assumed it was a trap, which it was, but not the kind he expected. What he didn't know was that Nzinga had already moved the bulk of her forces into the forest, where they now watched quietly from cover. She had trained her troops not only in battle formations, but also in the patience of silence. It's not easy, after all, to crouch near a termite mound while a bard whispers motivational lyrics about honor and legumes into your ear. But her soldiers did it. At her signal, a single owl call, or possibly just an actual owl who liked being involved, her troops emerged and circled the Portuguese from 3 sides. What followed wasn't a slaughter, but something more impressive, a demoralization. The Portuguese fired wildly into the trees, but Nzinga's forces never charged head-on. They taunted, disappeared, reappeared, and led the confused invaders deeper into marshland, until several boots were lost, and 1 cannon had to be abandoned because it got stuck in a puddle. And still the stew in the abandoned camp never burned. This tactic, let's call it weaponized hospitality, became one of Nzinga's signatures. She understood that an army running on fear couldn't sustain itself, but one running on rhythm, humor, and the smell of fresh okra stew had staying power. The war camps were not merely defensive, they were psychological operations. Every detail, fresh linens, evening drumming, even the goat's steady judgmental bleat, was part of a broader strategy to remind her soldiers that they were more than pawns. They were people with stories, rituals, and the right to rest between victories. Nzinga's nightly rituals became legend. After planning sessions, she would walk the camp perimeter, not as a queen, but as a leader. She asked how the stew was holding up. She nodded at guards. She made sure the bard wasn't telling that one long story about the lost sandal again. And sometimes she'd simply sit near the fires and listen. Historians still argue whether this was her true strength, her ability to be present, not just to rule from above, but to embody leadership among the people. It's difficult to start a rebellion against someone who has personally helped you adjust your hammock. Now here's a curious detail not often mentioned. Nzinga had a rotating schedule for camp stews. Mondays were usually fish-based. Wednesdays favored root vegetables, and Fridays were for surprises. One Portuguese spy who tried to sneak in during a surprise stew night reportedly joined the meal, declared it too spicy, and accidentally confessed his mission between coughs. He was promptly given a spoon and demoted to turnip duty. This spy, as it turned out, stayed on. He defected, became a loyal stew stirrer, and later wrote wistful letters home about the comfort of Nzinga's war kitchens. His name is lost, but his signature spice blend, now called Luandan ash, by some fringe food historians, was remembered in oral recipes for decades. Back on the battlefield, Nzinga continued to frustrate the Portuguese. They couldn't pin her down. Every time they believed they'd cornered her, she was already gone, leaving behind nothing but hammock hooks and a mild aroma of smoked yams. One general reportedly screamed into his helmet, "She's not a woman. She's a weather pattern." And in a way, he wasn't wrong. Nzinga moved like a storm, predictable only in her unpredictability. Her forces blended tactics from traditional Mbundu warfare with guerrilla mobility and a kind of theatrical flair that left her enemies disoriented and vaguely embarrassed. And so, as twilight draped its velvet over the treetops and the war camp settled into its nightly rhythm, Nzinga once again returned to her hammock. Somewhere nearby, a goat snored. The stew was still warm, and a soldier hummed an off-key lullaby about victorious vegetables. Victory, after all, wasn't always a bloody battlefield. Sometimes it smelled like coriander and discipline. If you've ever been to war, and I sincerely hope for your sake you haven't, then you'll know it's rarely as glamorous as the old scrolls make it seem. Mud gets everywhere, morale wears thin, and sooner or later, someone always forgets the ladle. But Nzinga, ever the unorthodox queen, made it a point of pride that her war camps defied such expectations. In fact, they were almost suspiciously pleasant. Her soldiers, many of whom had once trudged through the damp misery of older campaigns, were stunned to discover that under Nzinga's command there were rules about cleanliness, rules about sleeping hours, rules about stew portions. Yes, even stew had quotas. But the most astonishing rule of all, you weren't allowed to march without first changing your socks. If you didn't have socks, she provided strips of clean cloth. If you lost the cloth, you were sent to carry water for the goats, until further notice. Nzinga understood something that would make many future generals squint and mutter, "People fight better when they're not constantly miserable." Now, before we paint too cozy a picture, let's be clear. These weren't luxury spas with foot rubs and complimentary berries. This was still a war. Spears needed sharpening, enemy scouts needed outwitting, and goats needed discouraging from chewing on tent ropes. But under Nzinga's direction, the war camps became livable, and for many that made them lovable. Let us examine a day in one such camp. At sunrise, the drummers played not a battle cry, but a soft rhythm meant to rouse sleepers gently. Soldiers awoke not to shouts, but to stew already simmering. Morning tasks were assigned not with barked orders, but with posted scrolls and rotating shifts. The latrines, unusual to even have in some camps, were kept covered and treated with wood ash, to the deep gratitude of everyone's noses. And then, of course, there were the hammocks. Nzinga's war camps didn't sleep on the ground unless there was simply no tree tent pole or goat's back to string a hammock across. Even the cooks rested in netted slings, swaying between long poles after a day of chopping yams and slicing wild onions. The queen herself had a ceremonial hammock woven from bark cloth and raffia fibers lined with soft palm leaves and adjusted nightly to face the direction of the stars she liked best. One Portuguese observer, disguised poorly as a wandering merchant, once attempted to describe the camp in a letter. It is uncanny. They float above the dirt as if the earth itself is beneath their notice. And the queen, she floats, highest of all. Now, while Nzinga insisted on structure and order, she also encouraged a certain creative energy among her people. She believed in discipline, yes, but also in expression. This resulted in some fascinating camp customs. One such tradition was the hammock hymns, a nightly ritual where soldiers composed short songs in honor of the day's events. These were often humorous, sometimes deeply moving, and occasionally baffling. One particularly memorable hymn involved a lost chicken, a cursed gourd, and a very embarrassed lieutenant named Kuluwani. The song was so catchy it was banned for a week for disrupting evening drills. Nzinga encouraged these songs, believing laughter strengthened bonds. She was right. Troops who sang together didn't mutiny. They occasionally rolled their eyes, but they rarely rebelled. And then there was the issue of health care. Here, too, Nzinga surprised everyone. She appointed camp healers, both male and female, who administered traditional remedies, conducted rituals, and, if necessary, prescribed strategic naps. One herbalist became famous for treating battle stress with a mixture of crushed mint and tales about his pet lizard. His methods were never questioned, mostly because they worked, and also because the lizard looked judging. Nzinga herself met weekly with the head of logistics. Supply lines were meticulously maintained. If one stew pot broke, a replacement was dispatched by afternoon. If morale-dipped musicians were sent to the outer fire pits. If the bard began his cheese ballad again, someone gently escorted him to the latrines with a request for new material. And here's a strange but delightful footnote. Nzinga's camps were multilingual. She employed translators who doubled as performers, spinning battlefield news into songs, dances, or puppet shows. Even Portuguese defectors were given roles as cook scouts, or in one case a hammock inspector. That one might have been a bit of a stretch, but Nzinga believed everyone had a use, even if it was only spotting poor stitching. Historians still debate whether Nzinga's war camps were the first of their kind true mobile societies, with rank, ritual, and rhythm, or if they were simply the most successful example. What is undeniable is that they worked. They marched across jungles, slept under stars, dodged bullets and betrayal, and still managed to laugh over roasted cassava. They didn't just follow a queen, they followed Nzinga, a leader who made hammocks strategic, who saw stew as sacred, and who could command an army with a raised eyebrow and a spoon. Now, was it always peaceful? Of course not. There were fights, losses, even desertions. But what Nzinga built in those camps wasn't perfection. It was endurance. Even the goat knew that. If you ever find yourself cooking stew while your enemies approach, Queen Nzinga would advise two things. First, don't rush the spices. It makes you look nervous. Second, make sure your pots are loud enough to sound like an army. It was one of her favorite tricks. A pot clanging here, a ladle striking the rim. There a few soldiers whistling battle songs in the key of mildly intimidating. All this while actual troops repositioned silently through the underbrush. It confused enemy scouts just long enough for Nzinga's plans to tighten around them like a hammock knot. By the time the Portuguese realized they were being outmaneuvered again, it was already too late. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before that encounter, Nzinga had invited a group of regional allies to a council not in a palace or fortress, but in her signature war camp, just beside a river that had the decency to babble politely and reflect moonlight in an aesthetically pleasing way. The goal of the meeting was simple: coordinate a response to growing Portuguese aggression. But of course, nothing with powerful nobles is ever simple. They came in cloaks, carried gifts, and wore the kind of expressions that meant, "We're very honored to be here." And also, what's the exit strategy if she's angry? Most had heard the stories. Nzinga's brilliant tactics, her refusal to kneel the hammocks, the goat, all true mostly. Some embellished by traveling poets who didn't fully understand military ranks but loved a dramatic twist. The goat, for its part, seemed entirely at home among dignitaries, strutting between council members and occasionally chewing on ceremonial sashes. No one dared shoo it. Nzinga entered without fanfare in a robe dyed deep indigo, with her staff of command and a subtle smile that made everyone sit up straighter. She welcomed the guests, thanked them for arriving in one piece, and began outlining her proposal: a multi-kingdom coalition joint training exercises and coordinated supply networks. In return, she offered protection trade privileges and, of course, access to her famous stew recipes, which had begun circulating with more enthusiasm than most colonial reports. Some agreed immediately. Others hesitated, citing past betrayals or the sheer audacity of relying on a mobile queen. One particularly well-dressed noble asked, And what happens when the Portuguese attack while your hammock is still being strung? Nzinga, never one to miss a beat, replied. Then I string it tighter and swing toward them. I got a laugh, but also a nod. She wasn't joking. Still, not everyone was convinced. One chief, known for his paranoia and deeply suspicious mustache, declined the alliance and left the camp early. Later that night, his retinue encountered a misplaced campfire left just off the main trail. It was small, cozy, and had a pot of stew bubbling gently. Whether it was a coincidence or a warning remains debated. But the next morning, the chief returned, reconsidered, and agreed to the terms. No one asked about the stew. Nzinga's ability to command loyalty extended beyond charm or threat. It was in her steadiness, the way she listened, responded, and never let flattery cloud her vision. Even those who disagreed with her found themselves respecting her. One emissary from a rival clan remarked, "She speaks like a tree that's already seen the axe." A strange compliment, perhaps, but a true one. Now about that enemy column. Shortly after the council dispersed, word came that a Portuguese force was approaching from the south, heavily armed, well-fed, and led by a general who believed Nzinga was, quote, just another rebellious woman with a fondness for hammocks. A tactical error that Nzinga didn't rush to meet them. Instead, she prepared the camp. She ordered extra stew, meat heavy, thick enough to cling to your ribs and your doubts. She directed musicians to play louder than usual. She even had a few empty tents set up, complete with bedrolls and spare sandals, as if a full division had just marched in. Then she sent her real troops around the flanks. When the Portuguese arrived, they paused. What they saw was confusing, a bustling camp full of noise and smells and warmth, but oddly loose. A spoon clattered, a goat bleated, a bard sang a song about rice. It didn't look like a defensive position. It looked to the colonial eye like a picnic. And so they approached boldly, too boldly. That's when the trees around them rustled, and suddenly Nzinga's real army emerged, boxing them in with shield spears and the deeply unsettling sound of synchronized chanting. The Portuguese, startled and disoriented, did what many do when faced with the unexpected. They fired wildly and shouted at each other. Nzinga, watching from a rise, nodded once and signaled a retreat, not of her army, but of her decoy camp. Her troops fell back, letting the enemy trip over stew pots and misplaced banners, while the real fighters tightened their circle. The goat, by all accounts, remained unmoved. The skirmish ended with a Portuguese withdrawal and several officers demanding new assignments somewhere less inventive. One historian later wrote, "She fought not with might alone, but with meaning. Every action was a message." It's true. Even her stew had strategy. Now some rulers relied on brute force, others leaned on gold. Queen Nzinga, in contrast, had a deep and abiding faith in the power of time. Not flashy, not loud, and definitely not something the Portuguese were particularly good at understanding, but time wielded with cunning could undo even the best laid colonial plans, especially if those plans involved marching through swampy jungles in wool uniforms, while Nzinga sat dry, elevated in a hammock, sipping something herbal and judgmental. Her strategy was simple and maddeningly effective. Delay, distract, and disappear, then reappear somewhere entirely inconvenient. The Portuguese military, trained in rigid formations and accustomed to crushing resistance, quickly could not keep up. Their maps were often wrong, their guides unreliable, and their boots, oh, their poor boots, frequently gave up entirely after a week in the wetlands. Nzinga understood the landscape better than any foreign general ever could. She knew which rivers would flood in the afternoon, which hills could conceal an entire division, and which trees made the best lookout posts for hiding soldiers or mildly disgruntled poets. She used the terrain as a weapon not just against bodies, but against morale. Take, for instance, the campaign near the Kwanza River. The Portuguese had heard rumors very loud, very suspicious rumors that Nzinga's camp had relocated to a vulnerable stretch of land near the riverbank. They saw an opportunity. If they moved fast, they could strike her forces while unprepared. What they didn't realize was that Nzinga had planted those rumors herself. They arrived huffing and disheveled, only to find not a war camp, but a collection of decoy tents, several strategically burnt stew pots, and a set of hammocks hanging between trees that upon closer inspection were filled with dried cassava, wrapped to look vaguely human from a distance. One even had a carved wooden nose. The Portuguese general, fuming and possibly nursing a sprained ankle, ordered the tents searched. All they found was a small scroll written in flawless Portuguese. Nice try. Hope you brought extra socks. Nzinga's troops, meanwhile, were nowhere in sight because they were already circling around. That evening, after rain had turned the Portuguese camp into a glorified puddle pit, Nzinga's forces launched a swift strike. Lightning fast, aimed at supplies, and over before most of the colonial officers had finished wringing out their coats. It wasn't about killing, it was about breaking patience. And patience, it turned out, was a limited resource. Nzinga didn't need to defeat every enemy. She just needed them exhausted enough to go home. And she was very good at waiting. Now here's a curious little detail the more formal historians tend to skip. Nzinga timed many of her attacks around moon cycles, not just for visibility but for symbolism. A full moon was seen as a sign of clarity and vision. A new moon for hidden movements. Her camp even had a moon watcher, a quiet fellow who sat on a crate every night with a chart, a stick, and a goat, who liked to stand uncomfortably close. Was this astrology, strategy, sleep-deprived superstition? Historians still argue, but her record suggests something worked. Meanwhile, her enemies fell into the same trap over and over again. They'd assume she was cornered only to find she had no intention of standing still. They'd predict a frontal assault only to get outflanked by troops that had crossed rivers in silence, using reed snorkels and ancestral nerve. And all the while the war camps continued to move like soft whispers across the land. Each new site was pre-cleared, mapped and secured by advanced scouts who knew the lay of the land better than their own dreams. Tents went up quickly. Hammocks were strung with the efficiency of long practice. And stew. Well, stew was always ready before sunset. Even rest in Nzinga's command had strategy behind it. Her troops were assigned specific sleep rotations, with designated waking watchers and a rotating schedule of midnight stew light, not too spicy, with a hint of nutmeg if the quartermaster was in a good mood. She understood that tired soldiers made poor decisions, so she let the other side stay tired. Now there's a fringe account from a captured Portuguese soldier who later defected to Nzinga's forces. He wrote, "We never saw them. We only heard the drums. First near, then far, then somehow behind us. It was like being haunted by music." Some of this is likely exaggerated, possibly made more poetic by the fact that the soldier later became a war camp storyteller and insisted on wearing a cloak made of reeds. But the essence was true. Nzinga moved like rhythm, and she taught her people to move that way too. Young recruits were trained not only in combat, but in silence, in patience, in recognizing the sounds of birds that meant safe and those that meant run. They were taught to walk softly to avoid unnecessary noise, and perhaps most impressively, to resist the urge to argue with the bard about the correct rhyme for ambush. Meanwhile, Nzinga coordinated with other kingdoms not just through emissaries, but through cultural exchange. She sent stew recipes, medicinal herbs, song scrolls, and in one particularly confusing case, a ceremonial drum filled with dried mango slices and a note that read, "For when things get loud." What other queens sent dried fruit and tactical metaphors, in the same box, only Nzinga. And so the campaign of delay continued. The Portuguese chased shadows. Nzinga cooked dinner. And somewhere in the trees a goat watched it all and blinked slowly. If you've ever tried hosting a diplomatic gathering in the middle of a war zone, you'll know the two biggest challenges are: 1, making sure no one's poisoned, and 2, making sure no one tries to poison someone else. Queen Nzinga, of course, had a protocol for this. Step 1. All council meetings were to be held in open-air tents, so nothing could be whispered too quietly. Step 2. Every dish was tasted by a volunteer bard who insisted he had an iron stomach and no ambition. Step 3. Anyone who showed up with an unexpected gift was required to leave it with the goat. That goat by this point was more than just a camp mascot. It had become a kind of disheveled oracle. If it ignored your offering, you were probably safe. If it sneezed, you'd best wash your hands. And if it stared at you long, slow, and unblinking, you might want to reconsider your life choices. Nzinga's enemies often misjudged her approach to these gatherings. They assumed incorrectly that a war leader would only entertain violence. But Nzinga, ever the tactician, often used diplomacy like a spear, wrapped in velvet, soft to the touch until it landed. This brings us to the Council of the River Bend. It was meant to be a modest gathering, just a few tribal envoys, a Portuguese observer or two, and a handful of neutral parties who promised not to stir the stew. Nzinga planned it carefully. Tents arranged in a spiral. Watchmen posted discreetly. Musicians positioned close enough to interrupt tension with a well-timed flute trill. The stew was mild, the wine watered down for safety and clarity, and the hammocks were spaced far enough apart to discourage whispering. And yet someone brought a dagger, or rather several someones. It's unclear who planned it first, whether it was the Portuguese hoping to remove a strategic problem, or a local rival noble who thought the time was right. All we know is that just as Nzinga began reciting a proverb about fish who swim against the river but forget the crocodile, a hand reached for a hilt. What happened next was coordinated chaos. Nzinga, without flinching, stepped backward and vanished into the folds of a curtain. The nearest tent flap burst open. Her guards, disguised as servers with stew ladles and ceremonial fans, dropped their trays and drew short blades. One shouted something in Kimbundu that roughly translates to, "Now that's just rude." The attackers didn't last long. 3 were disarmed. 2 more fled and fell into the stew pit, an indignity that left them singed, seasoned, and very easy to identify later. The Portuguese observer fainted on his seat cushion. The bard, true to form, tried to improvise a ballad mid-melee, but was told firmly to save it for later. Historians still argue whether Nzinga orchestrated the entire event as a trap. It's entirely possible she allowed whispers of unrest to grow just enough to draw the traitors out, then made an example of them gently and with just enough flair to be memorable. What is confirmed is this: the next morning, the Council of the River Bend reconvened. The hammocks had been replaced, the stew restocked, and a fresh proverb was offered by Nzinga herself. If your guest brings a knife, offer them soup. If they bring two knives, ask which hand they write with first. That quote was later carved into a wooden sign near the camp kitchen, right above the goat's sleeping mat. This was Nzinga's genius blending showmanship with statecraft. She knew when to terrify and when to entertain, when to draw a blade and when to offer a spoon. Her court, if one could call a mobile network of warriors, cooks, scouts, and reluctant musicians, a court functioned on rhythm and presence. You didn't just follow Nzinga, you participated in her performance of leadership, and that performance traveled. After the attempted assassination, she didn't grow paranoid. She simply adapted. Council gatherings grew smaller, more fluid. Invitations were delivered verbally at random by runners who knew how to disappear into trees. And every new camp was now set up with 3 rings, outer watch, inner guard, and the inconvenient cousin ring for those nobles who couldn't be trusted but had to be invited anyway. She also introduced a new post, the stair captain. Their job, to stand silently behind her during councils and do nothing but glare. It was strangely effective. Meanwhile, Portuguese reports became increasingly exasperated. They couldn't pin Nzinga down. Their maps, once crisp and certain, were now covered in hastily scrawled guesses. Possible queen camp goats here. Ambush one officer, clearly at wit's end, wrote in the margin, "I think she knows we're reading these." She did. Nzinga's letters to the Portuguese were famous for their careful balance. She'd acknowledge their positions, express interest in peace, and then subtly mention the rainfall in their supply regions or the condition of their forward scouts. Nothing threatening, just aware. Her signature at the bottom was always the same, a looping Z, and the mark of her house, a coiled snake in a basket, not biting, just watching. And so diplomacy continued, knives or no knives. The stew was warm, the goat well fed, and Queen Nzinga, ever elegant, ruled from her hammock with a spoon in one hand, and history slippery, unwritten, but entirely hers in the other. To understand Nzinga's religious life is to try and untangle a hammock in the dark, twisting, layered, and unexpectedly full of strategy. Her spiritual journey was neither linear nor predictable. She baptized when it suited her worshipped ancestors, when she needed their strength, and on more than one occasion left visiting priests completely flummoxed as she politely nodded through sermons while planning a battle with her other hand. Let's begin with her first known conversion. During those early knife-edge negotiations with the Portuguese, Nzinga agreed to be baptized taking the Christian name Dona Ana de Sousa. She wore a modest dress. She bowed her head. A bishop dabbed her forehead with holy water, while side-eyeing the goat, who had somehow wandered into the church and was chewing on a hymnal. It was a photo opportunity before such things existed, a diplomatic performance dressed in faith. The Portuguese were delighted. At last they said she sees the light, which of course she did. But it was the light gleaming off colonial ambitions, a not necessarily divine revelation. Nzinga understood the value of appearances. The Portuguese liked baptized rulers. Baptized rulers could be civilized. Civilized rulers could be negotiated with. So Nzinga gave them what they wanted, publicly. Privately, she remained in communion with her ancestors, her kingdom's spirits, and the deeply rooted cosmology of the Mbundu people. In Nzinga's worldview, faith was not a one-size-fits-all garment. It was a cloak you adjusted depending on the weather and who was watching. Years later, as the political winds shifted, she renounced Christianity. or at least she appeared to. Reports vary. Some say she resumed full traditional rites, complete with animal sacrifices and forest offerings. Others claim she merely stopped attending Mass because the traveling priest kept confusing her name with that of a local baker. One confused missionary wrote, "She welcomed me with incense-cited psalms from memory, and then asked if my chicken wanted to speak to the river spirits. I do not know if this is progress." Nzinga never clarified. She didn't have to. What mattered was control of narrative, of ritual, of meaning. In her camp, there was room for both cross and calabash. One tent might host a Christian hymn, the next a divination ceremony, and somewhere in between the stew boiled on because no deity enjoys being invoked on an empty stomach. But not everyone was pleased with this spiritual ambidexterity. One priest, young, eager, and recently assigned to civilize the Matamba region, decided he would confront Nzinga about her inconsistency. He arrived in the camp with a sermon prepared 3 copies of the Bible and an unfortunate belief in absolute truth. He began well enough. Nzinga listened, nodded, even asked about the Latin translation of a particularly obscure verse. The priest, encouraged, spoke with more fervor. He quoted parables, gestured boldly, and declared loudly that one cannot serve 2 masters. Nzinga smiled. Then she offered him a bowl of stew. Now you must understand, stew in Nzinga's camp was symbolic. It was never just food. It was history, memory, and in some cases, a mildly psychedelic root that caused vivid dreams, and once made a drummer claim he saw time in the shape of a yam. The priest took a bite. He paused. Then he blinked. Then he slowly slid to the floor, eyes wide-mouthed, softly reciting the Apostles' Creed in 3 languages. He woke up a few hours later under a tree, gently fanned by a child and guarded by a chicken who may or may not have been spiritually significant. The priest didn't complain. In fact, he stayed, took up residence near the outer ring of camp, continued preaching to those who were curious, and eventually published a deeply conflicted account of Nzinga's camp life called Christ and the Queen and the Goat. Historians still debate the theological implications of that title, but Nzinga's religious blending wasn't confusion, it was sovereignty. By engaging with Christianity on her own terms, she refused to be colonized in spirit, even as the colonizers marched with cannons. She chose which rituals to adopt, which to ignore, and which to transform entirely. Take baptism, for example. After her initial conversion, she later instituted her own variation, a ceremonial river crossing, where warriors swore loyalty, not just to her but to the land and to the ancestors who had walked it before. It involved ash markings, singing, and always the presence of water. She called it a cleansing. The Portuguese, when they heard about it, declared it heretical. Her soldiers, however, declared it sacred. This was Nzinga's magic. She wove tradition and adaptation together like strands of braided grass, stronger together than either alone. And in doing so, she gave her people something rare in a time of turmoil, identity, with agency. Now here's a curious detail from one of her final years. Nzinga, nearing 70, summoned an old missionary she hadn't seen in decades. He arrived expecting hostility. Instead, she greeted him with bread stew and a question, "Do you still believe I belong to you?" He didn't know how to answer. Nzinga laughed and offered him a hammock. That night the priest slept among the stars, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and herbs. He woke up not with clarity but with peace, which in Nzinga's camp was often the same thing. And the goat slept beside him. Of course it did. If you were to compile a list of things Nzinga tolerated poorly, it would include treachery, bad stew, and somewhere near the top, A foolish idea brought across a desert on four legs, with a smug expression and entirely too many eyelashes. Yes, we've come to the camel. The story goes like this during one of the more fevered attempts to impress Nzinga or perhaps intimidate her. The line was often blurred. The Portuguese arranged for a special diplomatic gift to be delivered from one of their allies further north. A grand, rare beast of burden, they said, a symbol of endurance power and foreign connection. What arrived was a camel. To be fair, it was an impressive specimen. Tall, dappled, and draped in colorful cloth, it stood with the aloof majesty of an animal that had survived both deserts and bureaucrats. The Portuguese envoys presented it with theatrical flair, expecting awe. Nzinga did not flinch. She looked the camel up and down. Then she looked at her advisors. Then she said with the voice of someone who'd been awake too long and was out of polite syllables, "Can it carry stew?" The answer, unfortunately, was no. The camel, accustomed to dry climates and unenthused by jungle humidity, proceeded to sit down immediately and refused to stand again. It grunted. It sighed. It chewed something imaginary and stared directly at Nzinga's ceremonial goat, who returned the gaze with a mixture of suspicion and pure territorial disdain. Naturally, this became a camp sensation. For the next several days, soldiers came by just to look at the animal. Someone tried to feed it a yam. Another dressed it in a spare cloak and declared it the minister of sitting. A poet composed an ode titled "The Beast That Would Not Rise." It was not a flattering poem. Nzinga, for her part, ignored the drama, or appeared to. She was, in fact, paying very close attention. The camel represented everything she resisted a foreign idea imposed without understanding. It wasn't adapted to the land. It didn't serve the people. It had been presented not as a gift of respect, but as a symbol of power, the kind that assumed grandness was enough. And Nzinga was not a woman who could be swayed by tall creatures and colorful rugs. Eventually, she ordered the camel relocated to the edge of the camp. There it was given water shade, and a handler who specialized in difficult personalities, primarily bards and wounded dignitaries. The camel remained seated for 3 days, rose briefly on the fourth, and then wandered off during a thunderstorm, never to be seen again. Some say it was spotted weeks later near the river, traveling with a group of traders and responding only to Mbundu commands. Others insist the goat chased it off with a headbutt so righteous it caused a temporary eclipse. The truth, as always, remains tangled in legend and stew steam. But the lesson stuck. Nzinga gathered her court and used the camel incident as a teaching moment. This, she said, gesturing to the now empty clearing, is what happens when people try to bring something heavy and unhelpful into our story. It may look grand, but if it won't rise when you need it, it's just decoration. From that day forward, a sitting camel became slang among Nzinga's forces for anything showy but useless, like over-decorated spears, nobles with no troops, and love letters from Portuguese governors. Historians still argue whether the camel was ever real. Some suggest it was a metaphor retroactively invented to explain Nzinga's sharp political satire. But records from a confused supply captain mention one tall beast, wrong color, no interest in walking, so it's likely more than fable. And it fits. Nzinga had no patience for symbols without substance. She led from the front, slept among her soldiers, and governed with a clarity that left no room for hollow gestures. A ruler in her mind had to be as practical as she was poetic. Speaking of poetry, the bard who wrote "The Beast That Would Not Rise" went on to compose a whole series of animal epics, including "The Lizard Who Knew Too Much" and "The Chicken at Dawn." These became popular in camp evening gatherings recited between spoonfuls of okra stew and the occasional side-eye from the goat who never quite trusted artists. Through it all, Nzinga never forgot the camel. For years afterward, when a foreign emissary presented her with something grand and impractical, a jeweled sword too heavy to lift, or a tapestry that couldn't keep out the rain, she would raise an eyebrow and murmur, "Does it sit?" No one ever brought another camel, but the idea remained that grandeur without function is just weight. And in Nzinga's world, everything had to move, including the past. She was building something larger than resistance, larger than even a kingdom. A philosophy of leadership rooted in reality, not fantasy, in motion, not monument. And if a few smug animals had to learn that lesson the hard way, well, so be it. The goat certainly didn't mind. Nzinga, despite her reputation as a fierce tactician, had a surprisingly delicate touch when it came to managing suitors. This may seem like a minor footnote in a queen's war-heavy life, but you try ruling 2 kingdoms and not receiving at least a dozen, I can fix her letters a year. Some came with trinkets. Some arrived with musicians. One particularly bold noble sent a carved canoe filled with dried fruit and a note that simply read, "For your lips and your legacy." That man was promptly placed on stew rotation until he remembered how to speak in full sentences. Nzinga didn't dislike romance. It just had to fit the campaign schedule, and yet politics and courtship were never separate. Marriage in her world was less about love and more about leverage, forming alliances, gaining land, ensuring loyalty. Sometimes all 3, ideally without poisoning. Which brings us to the notorious incident of the poisoned fish proposal. Now we must be clear, Nzinga was not easy to impress. If you wanted her hand in marriage, you'd better come prepared with something better than charm. You'd need troops territory and a stew recipe that didn't offend the ancestors. A young chief from a neighboring region, clever, good-looking, and unfortunately far too proud of his ability to catch fish, with a stick sent word that he wished to court the queen. Not just court her, mind you, marry her, merge kingdoms, co-rule, perhaps even redecorate the tent interiors. He said all of this in a formal letter delivered via messenger wearing too much perfume and a very tight belt. Nzinga responded with an invitation. "Come dine with me," she wrote. "Bring your best catch." He arrived with 3 freshly caught river fish, plump and glistening, and an ego large enough to require its own seating mat. The camp cooks accepted the offering, inspected it closely, and began preparing a stew under Nzinga's watchful eye. But something was off. The fish smelled wrong, not spoiled exactly, but shifty. The queen ordered a quick test. A sliver of meat was offered to the goat, who sniffed it once, sneezed, and left the tent. The goat had never voluntarily left a meal before. Nzinga understood immediately. Whether the poisoning was intentional or the result of an improperly stored bait pouch remains debated. Regardless, she smiled graciously, thanked the suitor, and without missing a beat served a different stew to her guest, while keeping the original pot under close observation. Later that night, 2 kitchen boys with itchy fingers and poor impulse control snuck spoonfuls of the rejected stew. One passed out, the other developed a rash in the shape of a Portuguese cannon. It faded by morning, but the lesson lingered. The would-be suitor, oblivious, continued his proposal over dinner, waxing poetic about their combined territories, how their hammocks could face east together, and how his war drums were tuned to a particularly sensual rhythm. Nzinga nodded, laughed softly at the appropriate moments, and asked if his canoe could return before sundown. He left, flattered, confident, and very, very single. No retribution came. Nzinga didn't need to shout. She simply never wrote back. A month later, the chief's favorite stew cook was mysteriously reassigned to a distant outpost. His fishing gear disappeared during a routine supply check. One of his ceremonial drums was found floating face down in a creek, and word spread. Nzinga might forgive a diplomatic misstep. She might even tolerate a clumsy metaphor, but an insult disguised as courtship that she remembered. Not all her suitors were fools. Some genuinely admired her strength. Others hoped to bask in her fame. One noble from the interior region of Kasanje offered not only his hand, but also 40 head of cattle, a wagon full of copper ingots, and a chicken that could supposedly count. The chicken was later revealed to be just very good at guessing when to squawk. Nzinga declined. Still, she was not without companionship. Her inner circle included several trusted attendants and advisors, some male, some female, some a blend of both. And while the records vary, many suggest she maintained relationships that defied the narrow mold of royal matrimony. She chose closeness where she pleased and commitment where it was strategic. Affection was hers to offer, not to be claimed. One curious account recorded by a Dutch merchant describes an evening where Nzinga listened to a marriage offer from a European envoy, raised a finger, and interrupted him by asking, "Can you cook?" He faltered. She added, "Because if not, I'll have to marry your horse instead. It looks more prepared." The offer was withdrawn shortly after. Through all of this, Nzinga maintained her courtly rituals. Every few months, a festival was held to honor the ancestors, and during these, the court performed elaborate reenactments of famous events, battles, councils, and yes, awkward proposals. One actor, famous for his impression of the poisoned fish suitor, once had the entire war camp in tears from laughter. Even the goat snorted. In these moments, Nzinga was not just a queen, she was a legend in the making, both feared and beloved. She ruled not with icy detachment, but with fierce clarity and an unexpected warmth that slipped in between the strategies. And when the festivals ended, and the fires dimmed, and the goat curled up beside the last embers, she returned to her hammock alone by choice, beneath stars that remembered every name ever whispered beneath them, including hers. If you were to wander into Nzinga's war camp at twilight, assuming of course that you hadn't already been redirected by a scout, interviewed by a bard, or interrogated by a goat, you might notice a strange and lovely sound, singing hammocks. Not literally singing, mind you. The hammocks themselves didn't hum lullabies, though one poet insisted they did when the moon was right. No, the term came from the nightly chorus of voices that rose just after dinner, when the air cooled and the jungle insects tuned their own instruments. Nzinga had made it tradition each night, as the camp settled into its steady, swaying rhythm groups of warriors. Cooks, medics, and musicians would gather in clusters, some slung gently in hammocks, others wrapped in cloth on the ground and sing. Sometimes it was an old war song, steady and strong. Sometimes it was a playful call and response about whose goat had eaten whose boots. Sometimes it was a lullaby for the children in the traveling court, the sons and daughters of warriors, servants, and yes, even a few wandering defectors who had decided that Nzinga's hammock empire was preferable to anything back home. This musical habit became so ingrained that scouts used it as a signal. If you were close enough to hear the songs, you were near safety, or at least near a camp with excellent stew. But these songs were more than just morale boosters. They were memory. Nzinga insisted on oral histories, not the dry kind, but the living, breathing sort. Stories turned to melody, then passed from voice to voice, preserved like stew in a slow pot. One of the most beloved songs in the court's repertoire was the Queen's Walk, a slow, swaying tune about a night when Nzinga visited each hammock one by one, asking if the soldiers had eaten enough. According to the song, she adjusted one man's blanket, tied another's hammock tighter, and offered a spoon of honey root to a soldier with nightmares. Was it true? Historians still argue. But in Nzinga's camp, truth and love often rhymed. Her court was mobile, yes, but fully operational. Within those shifting tents and swaying beds, she maintained the full machinery of governance. There were scroll keepers, law scribes, cooks, trained in conflict resolution, and even a ceremonial librarian who was mostly responsible for remembering which tree someone left the important map under. Nzinga's portable court became the stuff of legend, not just for its mobility, but for its humanity. She brought along everyone she trusted, her top advisors, her most reliable scouts, and a rotating cast of artisans and spies who doubled as entertainers. If you could juggle and report enemy troop movements, you were hired. One man, known only as Uvela, was famous for carving miniature effigies of Portuguese generals out of wood, then performing dramatic reenactments of their latest blunders. He became so popular that Nzinga had to restrict his performances to once a week, lest productivity plummet. Then there was the quartermaster who only spoke in proverbs, a stew stirred by many spoons. Tastes of confusion, he'd say when anyone interrupted the cooks. Or, if your hammock squeaks in the night, the goat is probably underneath. No one could tell if he was wise or just very good at avoiding responsibility. Despite the occasional nonsense, the court worked. Orders were issued and followed. Messages traveled swiftly along practiced routes. Trials were held with fairness, though anyone caught lying under oath was required to spend 3 days wearing the goat's bell. The humiliation usually sufficed. Nzinga herself presided over this floating empire with an attention to detail that bordered on myth. She read reports by firelight. She corrected maps. She once spotted a supply discrepancy of exactly 2 yams and made the guilty steward explain the matter in verse. More than once, colonial observers wrote home in baffled tones, "She runs a government from a tent, a kingdom from a chair that swings." And yet it worked better than most fixed capitals. Mobility gave her flexibility. Hammocks allowed for rest and efficiency. The lack of stone walls didn't weaken her authority, it sharpened it. She could appear anywhere, be anywhere, and vanish before enemies could react. One account tells of a Dutch envoy arriving to negotiate only to find the court had moved overnight. He wandered lost for days before a singing scout led him to the new camp. When he asked how it had relocated so fast, the scout shrugged and said, "We never stop moving. We just pause better than most." Even governance had rhythm. Each morning began with 3 signals, a drum beat, a firelight spark, and the goat clearing its throat, though this last one was mostly coincidental. Once the signals passed, the camp woke. Orders were given, plans made, and somewhere in the background, a bard tuned a 1-stringed lute, preparing the day's news. Nzinga ensured the court didn't just survive, it flourished. Children were educated, elders consulted. Even dreams were recorded and analyzed in case they carried signs. A dream about rain might signal movement. A dream about stew going cold well that one usually meant someone forgot their duties. And as night fell again, the hammocks began to sway once more. Stories turned to songs. Soldiers sighed into sleep. And Nzinga, beneath a cloth canopy that fluttered like a royal flag, reviewed her maps one last time. before resting ears attuned to the soft chorus of her people singing themselves into tomorrow. Among the many things Queen Nzinga mastered, guerrilla warfare, alliance building, stew logistics, the delicate dance of trade negotiation was perhaps her most overlooked art. Not because it lacked drama, mind you, but because no one expected a woman who once routed a column of Portuguese troops using decoy hammocks and passive-aggressive goats to also be a financial strategist. And yet she was. Nzinga didn't just fight empires, she out-traded them. Her caravans snaked across the interior, loaded with salt ivory iron and fabric dyed in patterns so intricate that European traders once mistook them for maps. They weren't, of course, but Nzinga let them believe it. It helped with negotiations. Now you might be wondering, how did a woman constantly on the move run a trade network with flair? She established mobile trade outpost tents by rivers marked trees, in dense forest, signal drums, on ridge lines, all manned by trusted merchants who could pack up shop faster than you could say price volatility. These were not dusty roadside stalls. These were economic nodes cleverly disguised as rest stops, and she knew what the Portuguese wanted people mostly. Enslaved bodies traded for muskets, gunpowder mirrors, and cloth. It was a brutal market, and Nzinga, like every African ruler of her time, had to navigate its blood-slicked edges. But here, too, she played a longer game. Nzinga, at various points in her reign, alternated between participating in and resisting the slave trade. When necessary, she engaged offering captured enemies or criminals as bargaining chips. But she also established sanctuaries, welcoming escaped slaves from neighboring territories and resettling them within her growing mobile kingdom. Some of her fiercest warriors were former captives. Some of her cleverest merchants had once worn chains. Historians still argue whether Nzinga's dual position was contradiction or strategy. The answer, predictably, is both. She used the very market that sought to destroy her people to fund their defense. She traded to gain weapons. She sheltered to gain loyalty. She turned the machinery of empire back on itself, one quietly weighted scale at a time. One particular deal became the stuff of whispered legend. A Dutch trader, young, ambitious, slightly allergic to cassava, arrived at her camp, hoping to strike a deal for rare spices and iron tools. He brought muskets, of course, and a chest full of blue and white ceramics he claimed were all the rage in Amsterdam. He wore a large hat, very large, possibly to hide how little he actually knew. Nzinga greeted him warmly, offered him stew, showed him her stockpiles, let him see just enough to imagine he had the upper hand. Then she began to raise one eyebrow. That's when he knew he was in trouble. She asked about his ship, its capacity, the number of crew, whether they were well fed, whether any of them had ever seen a goat. He tried to steer the conversation back to barrels and beads. She asked if he liked music. Then she had the bard play a 5-minute song about a trader who lost everything because he didn't test the merchandise. By the time negotiations resumed, he had agreed to half the price and thrown in a silver brooch to sweeten the deal. Nzinga thanked him, then gave the brooch to her head scout, who used it later as a signal charm during an ambush. Multi-purpose leadership. Her dealings with the Dutch were particularly savvy. She knew they disliked the Portuguese and saw in them an opportunity. She offered access protection and local goods in exchange for arms and recognition. The Dutch, impressed by her professionalism and mildly terrified by her goat, signed more than one treaty. Whether they honored all of them is another matter. But Nzinga notably got what she needed, and she never traded blind. Before every major deal, she held quiet meetings with her advisors, including a woman named Kulumba, a merchant with an encyclopedic knowledge of iron-weight regional dialects and the exact facial twitch a Portuguese officer made when trying to lie about exchange rates. Kulumba's nickname in camp was the Ledger, and she once corrected a Dutch trader's math before he even made the error. Nzinga trusted her completely. Another vital figure in these transactions was the camp translator, an elder named Munzazi, who spoke 7 languages and refused to wear shoes. He believed barefoot negotiations grounded the truth. He also believed that shouting in Dutch made the words more honest. No one corrected him. These were Nzinga's unsung weapons, precision patience, and a camp economy that hummed like a well-tuned lute. Trade in her world wasn't just commerce, it was communication. Each deal was a message. I am still here. I am still sovereign. I will not disappear. And when the Portuguese tried to undermine her offering better deals to rival chiefs, spreading rumors of her decline, Nzinga responded by doubling her trade volume for the next 3 months and ordering a musical parade in front of the nearest colonial fort. The bard composed a special verse. You sold us rope and we made hammocks. You sold us guns and we made rhythm. It was catchy. As always, Nzinga's victories weren't won by force alone. They were earned, bartered, baked, sung, and calculated down to the last copper coin and clove. And that night, in the heart of the camp, beneath stars that flickered like flint sparks, the traders rested in their hammocks. The stew smelled faintly of ginger, the ledger was balanced, and Queen Nzinga, who had once been exiled with nothing but a mat and a name, smiled into the dark. Because tonight her empire was not only surviving, it was profiting. Of all the strategies Queen Nzinga employed in her long campaign against colonial encroachment, hammock diplomacy, portable courts, suspiciously articulate goats, perhaps the most quietly devastating was the one she called, with characteristic understatement, the sleeping warrior. It began, as many of her ideas did, with exhaustion. The Portuguese had grown tired of marching, tired of the jungle, tired of trying to capture a woman who kept vanishing, only to reappear on higher ground with more allies and a pot of stew so good it could undo morale with a single sniff. They wanted a decisive victory, and so they advanced heavily armed, heavily armored, and heavily unprepared for what Nzinga had in store. It was a peculiar sight. The war camp looked dormant. Hammocks were strung, but mostly empty. The fires were low. A few guards milled about in plain view, yawning audibly and occasionally stretching in theatrical slow motion. The sound of snoring, too regular to be genuine, drifted through the underbrush. It was less like a military base and more like an unusually sleepy picnic. The Portuguese scouts reported back they're vulnerable, asleep, ripe for the picking. They weren't. Nzinga's army was wide awake, hidden in layers, beneath camouflaged netting, up in trees, beneath shallow trenches, just outside the flickering torchlight. They had been trained for this, for quiet tension for midnight, stillness for the calm before a misjudged storm. The trap was called the Sleeping Warrior because it lured with rest. It invited complacency. And then it punished arrogance with surgical precision. That night the Portuguese approached in silence, or what passed for silence in their boots, which were still not suited for muddy terrain. They crept toward the edges of camp eyes, peeled for signs of resistance. And then just before they breached the outer ring, the music started, soft at first, a single drum beat, then 2, then voices, a lullaby slow and mournful, a war song disguised as a dream. The invaders hesitated, not because they recognized the tune, but because they realized too late that lullabies don't usually come from camps under siege. Then the torches flared brighter. Then came the war cry. Nzinga's warriors rose from the earth itself, emerging in synchronized waves from hollows trees, shadowed trenches, and even the river's edge. Their eyes reflected fire. Their spears did not miss. The Portuguese never stood a chance. It wasn't the bloodiest ambush Nzinga ever led. It wasn't even the largest. But it was by many accounts the most poetic. She turned sleep into bait, fatigue into weaponry. And in doing so, she reminded every would-be conqueror of the most painful truth in war. Never assume your enemy is resting, just because you're tired. This battle, though not widely recorded in European accounts for obvious reputation-saving reasons, became legendary in Nzinga's oral tradition. It was reenacted during festivals, painted in cave murals, and commemorated with a stew recipe called the Dreamer's Dish, which involved 3 types of root vegetable and a preparation method that required exactly 2 hours of silence before serving. Nzinga's genius wasn't just in executing the plan, it was in the training that made it possible. Her troops practiced stillness, not just physical but emotional. They were taught to slow their breath, to keep their heartbeats steady, to sleep with one eye open, and to rise from rest with spear in hand and song in mouth. This wasn't just warfare. It was choreography. Even the goat had a role. Positioned near the front of the camp, it was trained to stomp 3 times if it saw movement, 4 if the movement had an accent. A bard later added this to a camp song rhyming stomp with romp, and earning a mild scolding from the queen who disliked laziness in lyrics. And so the sleeping warrior strategy became more than a maneuver. It became a metaphor for Nzinga herself, for her kingdom, for a people who had been underestimated, overlooked, and left for conquered, only to rise in the dark and reclaim the fire. She used the story. Whenever a new recruit doubted the queen's wisdom, they were told of the night the camp slept and still won. Whenever a village feared they were too small to resist, they were reminded that sleep can be a weapon in patient hands. And Nzinga, she never stopped inventing. Her war camps began incorporating controlled stillness drills, periods where the entire camp went quiet to simulate vulnerability and train awareness. These exercises unnerved even veteran warriors. But they worked. They turned fear into discipline, chaos into calm. Later, a European missionary observed one such drill and wrote in his journal, "They were so still. I believed the camp had been abandoned by life itself. I feared the worst until a small child passed me and whispered, 'Shh, we're pretending.'" Not all war is noise. Nzinga understood the power of the pause. She once said, according to camp memory, "There is strength in silence. It carries the weight of what hasn't happened yet, and in that space between breath and strike, between sleep and waking, Nzinga ruled." So if you ever hear a story where a queen defeated an army with lullabies, believe it, it happened. And the stew that night was, by all accounts, absolutely flawless. Now, it is one thing to lead warriors and quite another to lead stories. Queen Nzinga, having mastered both, was not content with simply winning battles. She wanted to shape narratives to ensure that even the most absurd moments of her rule were remembered correctly, or at least remembered well. Which brings us inevitably to the goat-riding princess. It's a tale told so many times around evening fires that its details vary wildly depending on who you ask. In some versions, the goat was white as moonlight and wore ceremonial bells. In others, it had one eye, a vendetta against oranges, and once kicked a bishop into a ditch. But most agree on this much: it happened during one of Nzinga's more theatrical military displays, and it involved her niece, a battle horn, and an audience of stunned colonial officers. The princess name lost to time but preserved in song, as she who rode swiftly was no stranger to drama. Raised in Nzinga's court, she had grown up among war chants and hanging hammocks, taught to read both poetry and battlefield terrain with equal fluency. At age 16, she was already leading scouting missions. At 17, she allegedly outnegotiated a Dutch trader into giving up his hat and his boots. But it was at 18, in the middle of a tense standoff with Portuguese forces near the river Quango, that she truly made her name. The enemy had positioned themselves across the field, cannons aimed, soldiers ready. They were waiting for Nzinga to blink first. And as it happened, Nzinga did send a rider, just not the one they expected. Out of the trees came a figure riding a goat, not a horse, not a donkey, a goat. The animal trotted confidently, nostrils flared, wearing a small red saddle and what appeared to be a brass medallion tied around its neck. Atop it sat the princess braids, flying eyes alight with mischief, and a war horn slung across her back like a musical weapon of destiny. The Portuguese did not know what to do. A young officer shouted, "It's a decoy." Another muttered, "That goat looks dangerous." One commander simply dropped his spyglass and said, "I need to lie down." And the princess, never one to waste good confusion, raised her horn and blew 3 sharp notes that echoed off the trees like prophecy. The attack came seconds later from the sides. Nzinga's forces had already encircled the enemy and waited only for the signal. The goat, whether part of the plan or simply enjoying the spectacle, kicked into a light canter and continued trotting through enemy lines as chaos broke loose. According to the bard who immortalized the event, in a song that somehow rhymed warrior with galloping furrier, the princess dismounted midfield, seized a fallen musket, and proceeded to lead a charge with the same expression you'd expect from someone critiquing under-seasoned soup. The battle was won quickly. The Portuguese retreated, demoralized and deeply unsure if they'd just been bested by livestock. One general, later interrogated, muttered, "It wasn't just the goat. It was the confidence." Nzinga naturally rewarded her niece not with medals or titles, but with a hammock woven from goat hair and a new stew named in her honor. The princess's prance, they called it, made with bold spices and served only after telling the story at least twice. But the tale didn't stop at the borders of Matamba. Soon, neighboring villages began whispering about the goat-riding queen in training. Songs spread. Dutch and Portuguese maps were updated to include a curious symbol, a goat's head, near regions considered Nzinga territory. It was meant as a warning, it became a legend, and as with all legends, variations bloomed. One version claimed the goat could understand 3 languages and played the lute. Another said the princess was pregnant at the time and the unborn child kicked in rhythm with the horn blast. A third insisted the goat later demanded its own hammock and refused to share stew with the bard. Nzinga never corrected any of them. She understood the power of myth. In a time when stories traveled faster than armies, she made sure hers were unforgettable. If a goat helped, so be it. Let her enemies waste time preparing anti-goat tactics while she maneuvered elsewhere. And behind the laughter lay something serious. Nzinga was training her successor, The princess, for all her flair, was a shrewd student. She learned not just tactics, but tone, how to look an emissary in the eye while refusing a treaty, how to stir stew while planning a siege, how to use surprise not just in war, but in diplomacy. Nzinga knew she wouldn't rule forever, but she could leave behind something stronger than borders a style, so she encouraged flair, allowed absurdity, laughed when the bard got too creative, and even let the goat strut around with ribbons on feast days. Because she knew what all wise rulers know. Empires fade, but stories gallop. It is a fact universally acknowledged, at least in Nzinga's court, that any battle, however victorious, is vastly improved if your maps do not catch fire. This brings us to what came to be known in both song and stew as the fire that didn't burn the maps. It was late in the dry season. The air was sharp with dust, the jungle crackled, and even the goats were drinking with greater urgency. Nzinga's camp had set up near the edge of a low ridge where wind moved like gossip, fast, persistent, and usually on fire by the end of the afternoon. The campaign had been going well. Nzinga's forces had outmaneuvered 2 separate Portuguese columns, recruited a band of deserting musketeers from a rival chief's army, and acquired a shipment of iron pans from the Dutch, though one of them had to be returned because it sounded too much like a gong when dropped. The mood was high. The stew was perfect. The maps were laid out in the command tent, 3 full goat hides worth of hand-scribed terrain, annotated with careful notes, directional arrows, and at least one doodle of the bard, with his lute stuck in a tree. Nzinga and her advisors were reviewing plans when a runner burst in. Fiery panted from the east, fast. Now war campfires were not uncommon, cooking flames, signal torches, occasionally an overly ambitious stew assistant who misunderstood the phrase slow simmer. But this was a wildfire, dry brush wind whipped, barreling toward the outer edge of camp like an army of heat and panic. Immediately Nzinga stood, not panicked, not shouting, just standing. Then she began issuing orders. Tents with weapons were dismantled first. The stew pits were doused with water, then covered in wet cloth to prevent embers from turning the dinner into a cremation. The war goats were herded downhill by 2 children and a soldier, with a calming voice and a suspicious number of apples in his pouch. But most importantly, the maps had to be saved. Now these weren't just parchment scribbles. They were works of memory and collaboration, compiled by scouts, refined by generals, inked by poets, who were conscripted because their handwriting was emotional but legible. Losing them would be like blinding the court mid-march. And so Nzinga took one map herself, rolled it tight, and slipped it into a bamboo case. She handed another to her chief scout, who secured it beneath his cloak and dove into a ravine with the dramatic flair of someone who knew this moment would one day be reenacted by actors in full costume. The third map, however, was still stretched on the planning table. The fire was close now. Flames licked the edge of the command tent. Smoke coiled like a curious question. Nzinga looked at the map, then at her advisor, then at the bard who had inexplicably begun narrating the scene aloud in verse. "Stop that," she said, and with that she lifted the entire table. Yes, Queen Nzinga, warrior, diplomat, stew connoisseur, heaved the planning table up over her shoulder and carried it out of the tent like it was nothing more than an awkwardly balanced laundry basket. Her soldiers froze, then 1, then 2, then all of them moved. A water line formed. Wet cloths were passed. The fire was slowed, not stopped entirely, but diverted. It burned a few tents, scorched a hammock or 2, and completely incinerated the bard's latest draft of the warrior queen and the whistling leaf which some say was a mercy. But the maps unburned. Later that night, as the winds died and the stars returned to their posts, Nzinga stood by the edge of Camp Soot, on her face hands blackened, and watched as her advisors gently unrolled the preserved maps. A cheer went up, not raucous, but deep and sincere. That's when she noticed something odd. The one map that had been rolled inside bamboo. It had changed. Not melted, not ruined, but modified. The heat had caused the ink to bloom, spreading into strange fractal shapes that when looked at from a distance resembled terrain, hills and valleys, a hidden ravine none had marked, a route that might lead to a water source. Nzinga stared. Then softly she said, "Sometimes fire writes too." This moment became a turning point not just tactically, but spiritually. The next morning the fire circle was blessed as sacred ground. A new stew was made with charred root vegetables. The scouts, who helped preserve the maps, were promoted and given hammocks closer to the central tent. And the table, scorched but intact, was repurposed into an altar for offerings to ancestors who watched over maps and mayhem alike. The incident also inspired a new law. No scrolls were to be stored near the goat's sleeping area just in case. The goat had taken to sleeping near warm embers and had a known history of unpredictable loyalty when startled. Now here's the curious historical wrinkle. Portuguese reports from that same week mention a strange column of smoke rising from Nzinga's position, and note that the queen may be in retreat, as her camp appears to have been consumed. It wasn't. She was still there, just a little warmer, slightly ashier, and as always several moves ahead. Because in Nzinga's world, even disaster could be harvested, even flames could be folded into the story, even smoke could conceal strategy. And sometimes when the fire passes, what it leaves behind is not ruin, it's clarity. Dinner with Queen Nzinga was never just dinner. It was theater diplomacy, psychological sparring, and if the occasion required a test of spiritual resilience involving utensils made of bark and questions asked at awkward moments, this particular evening, deep into her 4th decade of war, Nzinga had invited representatives from 3 rival factions, 2 tribal chieftains with shaky loyalty, and 1 Portuguese emissary whose mustache was rumored to twitch whenever he lied. The tent was prepared, no chairs, no plates, no spoons. Instead, a wide, low mat woven from palm fibers, 3 shallow bowls, hand-carved, and 1 very large pot of stew, in the center bubbling contentedly, as if it were unaware of the intense political weight being placed upon it. Nzinga's rule for this meal: no one eats with their hands until everyone is seated, and once the meal begins, no one may speak until after the 2nd bite. This was not just formality. This was control. The emissaries arrived and hesitated. The Portuguese man glanced around for a fork. One of the tribal chieftains muttered about hygiene. The other, older and wiser, quietly removed his jewelry and knelt on the mat with a nod that said, "Yes, I remember how this works." Nzinga entered last. She wore no crown, no jewels, just a simple robe, a blade at her hip, and a leaf-tied bundle of salt, which she placed gently beside the stew. She sat cross-legged, made a small gesture with her hand, and the meal began. The first bite was silent, the second observant. And then, when the third was raised but not yet eaten, Nzinga spoke. "So, who among you will trade safety for pride?" It was not a riddle, it was a prompt. One the Portuguese emissary didn't quite understand, and one the younger chieftain wished very much to ignore. Nzinga, however, never wasted a spoonful. She continued eating, eyes on her guests, letting the silence steep. like a slow herbal broth. What followed was not a loud argument. No Nzinga hated shouting at dinner. It was instead a slow, simmering unraveling. The emissary began to sweat. The chieftains exchanged glances. Eventually one spoke, offering to increase his levy of troops in exchange for access to Dutch firearms. The other asked if the queen might bless his crops if he agreed to patrol a disputed border. The Portuguese man, sensing he was losing control of the room and possibly his portion of stew, offered to reduce the local tax on fabric imports. Nzinga did not immediately respond. Instead, she asked the emissary to pass the cassava. This, as it turns out, was a test. He hesitated, unsure which dish was cassava. His hand hovered between two bowls. He chose poorly. Nzinga's eyebrow rose exactly 3 degrees. The bard seated just outside the tent began softly composing a verse about the man who mistook yams for cassava and insulted his host with starch. The emissary, now aware of his diplomatic error, attempted a recovery by complimenting the seasoning. Nzinga nodded. Yes, she said. The salt came from rebels who surrendered last week. Their cook was quite good. I decided to keep the recipe. The room went quiet. She let it linger, then reached into her robe and withdrew a folded letter. It was Portuguese, stamped, unopened. She placed it beside her bowl and said, "This arrived 3 days ago, from your superiors. I haven't read it. I wanted to see if you'd lie before I did." The emissary, caught between sweat and pride, blinked. Nzinga waited. He cleared his throat. "It says he guessed that they will honor the ceasefire, that they wish for peaceful trade." Nzinga, spoon midair, smiled. She handed the letter to her aide, who opened it, read it, paused, then read it again. No such offer, the aide said. But they do ask if she'll send slaves in exchange for wine. Nzinga sighed, placed her spoon down gently, and stood. The meal was over. The emissary was escorted out, politely, with stew still on his breath and regret clinging to his boots. The chieftains remained. Nzinga turned to them and said, "We eat without tools because we must remember what it is to touch the thing we want." That line would later be quoted in 5 languages, carved into 3 walking staffs, and curiously embroidered into a ceremonial pillow, gifted to her by a Dutch merchant who misunderstood its meaning but loved the dramatic flair. The no utensils dinner became a staple of Nzinga's strategy. It created vulnerability, leveled power, removed pretense. No one could posture while licking stew from their fingers. It also ensured no one forgot who had cooked the meal or who had chosen the ingredients. In a time when treaties were folded and hidden like dried leaves, Nzinga used food as truth, stew as sincerity, and silence as leverage. Later that night, as the embers died down and the goat curled beside the last warm pot, Nzinga reviewed the letter one more time. She did not burn it. She placed it in her archive, a simple wooden chest marked with the symbol of an eye drawn over a river. Beside it sat a ladle, wrapped in silk, a reminder that even at the table the queen never fed anyone without a reason. Peace, when it finally came to Queen Nzinga's kingdom, did not arrive with the sound of trumpets or declarations carved into stone. It arrived like a sigh, a long, slow exhalation across the plains of Matamba, a weary hush after decades of fire stew and footsteps. Nzinga had ruled for over 30 years, fought across jungles, rivers, and ideas, outlasted kings, envoys, generals, and even the goat, who had become a minor deity in 3 separate villages, and reportedly reappeared as a cloud on one memorable morning. But now, with her hair silvered and her hammock frame reinforced for comfort, Nzinga did something unexpected. She made peace. It wasn't sudden. These things never are. There had been years of signals, Portuguese governors less eager to fight, Dutch traders shifting their priorities, internal pressures waning. A general once her enemy sent her a basket of pine nuts and a note that read, "I'm tired." Are you? She was. But more than that, she was ready. The treaty process was long, exhausting in its own way, no swordplay, just clauses, clauses, and more clauses. But Nzinga handled it with the same discipline she'd once applied to warfare. She read each line, asked questions, crossed out entire paragraphs while sipping tamarind water. She once paused a negotiation for 6 hours because the Portuguese translator mispronounced the word for sovereignty. When the final treaty was signed, Nzinga did not smile. She simply nodded, said, "That will do," and requested a bowl of stew. Peace was not the end of her reign, but it was a new beginning. With the Portuguese finally agreeing to cease hostilities and recognize her authority over Matamba, she could focus on something she had rarely been afforded in her life. Building. First, she reorganized the kingdom not as a fortress, but as a network. Roads were repaired, villages fortified, elders called back into the fold. She sent her scouts not to chart enemy movements, but to ask what people needed: clean water, stronger walls, fewer surprise bards, yes to all three. Her court, once mobile, began to root itself in a new capital, not Luanda, not the old seat of Ndongo, but a place in the center of the land surrounded by trees she liked and hills that smelled of rain, a place where hammocks could swing peacefully, not in anticipation of ambush, but simply for rest. And rest became important. Nzinga began to rise later in the mornings, delegated more, spoke often of memory. Her knees ached, her breath sometimes caught, but her mind still fierce. She recalled troop formations from 20 years prior with more clarity than what she'd eaten yesterday. Though, to be fair, she always remembered the stew. Foreign envoys still visited. Some expected grandeur. They were instead greeted by a small court, strong-willed advisors, and a queen in comfortable robes who offered them hand-washed cassava and a seat near the breeze. If they asked about her battles, she changed the subject. If they asked about the goat, she offered them a spoon. One Dutch official, fresh-faced and brimming with self-importance, asked, "Do you think history will remember you as a conqueror or a queen?" Nzinga replied, "I prefer to be remembered as rested." Her people adapted to peace quickly. Children born after the final treaty never knew what it meant to hide beneath stew pots during cannon fire. They learned her name from songs, not war cries. They played games pretending to ride goats into imaginary battles. And when elders corrected them, they listened because even fantasy needed footnotes. But peace wasn't perfect. There were still disputes, still jealousies, still the occasional Portuguese official who believed he could bend the treaty if he brought enough gifts and a well-oiled smile. He couldn't. Nzinga remained sharp until the end, and when she felt her strength wane, she called a meeting, not dramatic, not ceremonial. Just her advisors, her closest family, and the camp cook, who'd been with her since the time of the fake battle stew. "I'm tired," she said. Not of ruling, just of carrying it all myself. They nodded. No one interrupted. She named her successor, one of her sisters, a capable leader, already respected, already ready. The transition would be smooth, quiet, the opposite of everything Nzinga's own ascent had been. That night she walked through the camp one last time, not to check defenses, just to see. The hammocks, the kitchens, the maps, the tree where someone had once carved, "Beware of Princess Goat Rider." She paused there a while, smiled, then returned to her quarters and rested. not in her throne, not on a mat, but in her hammock, the very same one from her earliest campaigns, repaired many times, smelling faintly of old spices and victory. When news of her passing came, it moved like mist. No great announcement, no trumpet, just silence. Reverent, deep. Even the goat descendant of the goat probably was said to have stood still all morning. The bard didn't sing for 3 days, and when he finally did, it was just a whisper. She ruled like fire. She rested like dusk. They say that legacies aren't built in palaces or carved into stone. They're woven thread by thread into hammocks that sway beneath stars, into spoons passed from hand to hand, into stories that linger long after the fire has cooled. And Queen Nzinga's legacy was a heavy crown, but one that still swung gently in memory long after her war drums had gone quiet. Her death was not the end of the story. If anything, it became its most curious beginning. In the years that followed, her court continued to function almost exactly as she'd left it, mobile, at times firmly rooted at others, with advisors quoting her not from scrolls, but from things she once said while sipping water or correcting a map with a chicken feather. Her sister succeeded her, yes, but always with the caveat, Nzinga once said. That phrase began so many decisions, it eventually became a kind of blessing, and sometimes a gentle warning. Nzinga once said not to trust a man who offers peace with 2 spoons. Nzinga once said, the goat knows things we don't. Nzinga once said, you can tell a kingdom by its stew. She was remembered not just as a leader, but as an approach to life. Her war camps became schools, her tactics studied by future generations of generals and grandmothers alike. One coastal village built a full-size wooden replica of her hammock and insisted all negotiations must take place beneath it. It swayed, it creaked, but it held. Traveling merchants told tales of the queen who could negotiate with the Dutch one day, trap an ambush the next, and still find time to discipline a lazy bard with a well-aimed yam. And even in distant parts of the continent, places she never ruled, never visited, Nzinga's name carried weight. She made the colonizers blink. She made treaties without forgetting her own gods. She made the stew herself. One fringe tale, surely apocryphal, claims that years later a group of Portuguese officers became lost in the interior and stumbled upon a quiet clearing. There under a tree a woman sat reading a scroll beside a large, gently snoring goat. They asked her name. She smiled and said, she taught me how to wait. They didn't find their way home for 3 more days. And what of the archives? Ah, yes. Nzinga's collection of scrolls, maps, letters, and stew-stained battle plans, stored carefully in sealed gourds, waterproof baskets, and one particularly temperamental chest that snapped shut whenever anyone mentioned surrender. Many were eventually recovered, preserved through oral retelling, or passed down by cooks who had once stirred soup with one hand and memorized treaties with the other. Some are still studied. Some remain lost. One scroll discovered generations later bore no writing, just a single mark, a stylized Z, next to a coil of smoke. Below it a faint stain that when sniffed still smelled of ginger and ash. And the goat-well descendants of the legendary war goat continued to roam freely around certain compounds for years, enjoying special status. Not quite pets, not quite omens, just participants. One particularly ornery goat was nicknamed General Trot and was known to disapprove loudly of any speech lasting more than 5 minutes. But it wasn't the goats that carried Nzinga's story. It was the rhythm, that same slow, confident rhythm of her leadership, the way she paused before speaking, The way she moved her armies not with force but with patience. The way her hammock swayed without ever falling. She had made power soft, made resistance flexible, made survival into an art. And in the end, Nzinga left behind something even greater than victories. She left behind style, a way of walking, a way of negotiating, a way of being both feared and loved, not for cruelty, not for conquest, but for choosing clarity. So now as the fire dies and the air cools, we remember her not with shouts, but with stillness. We sway gently. We taste memory in the stew. We sing softly of the queen who brought war to a halt and rest to a world that had nearly forgotten how. The night deepens now. The coals in the stew pit have settled into a soft red glow, barely flickering. The last songs from the campfire drift off into silence, replaced by the steady breath of hammocks swinging gently between trees. Even the goat, yes, that goat has finally curled its legs beneath it, exhaling one long, world-weary sigh. Above, the stars keep quiet watch. The jungle rustles, not in alarm but in rhythm, a slow pulse like a drum that's been playing since before time learned to count. Somewhere in the dark, a child dreams of riding a goat into battle. Somewhere else, an elder murmurs the name of a queen before sleep takes hold. Everything has slowed. Even memory walks more gently now. The maps are folded. The stew has cooled. The bard, having finally run out of verses, hums a single note, low, soft, steady. Nzinga is gone, but her rhythm remains. It's in the way the leaves lean toward the breeze. It's in the curve of a river that never asked for permission. It's in the hush that follows a long, long fight. Tonight we rest in that hush. Let your mind drift like a canoe on still water. Let your worries unspool like a map too tightly folded. Let the hammock cradle you swaying, whispering, everything's quiet now. You're safe. Let the rest take you.